So, how's everyone doing? I hope you're not. I hope you're not too hungry for lunch, and I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly. This was a dense paper, but I think I've done my best to compress it down to something a bit more manageable for today. Of course, I don't need to introduce myself. Thank you, Cyril. But I will be talking about the paper that I wrote with my consulting firm, the need for a Canadian sovereign space launch capability. And I published this on January 27th, and I like to think that it was fortuitous timing, especially for a lot of the momentum that has started, especially in Canadian space launch. I know we've already had one mention today of the value chain, but the way I approach space launch and the way I see it, I think the value chain, the industry value chain in Canada is critical to understand why we need this capability. Today, we can do everything in Canada to build, to operate, and to derive value from space assets. But we cannot launch payloads to space. And this is particularly salient given the fact that without launch, you don't really have a space industry. Launch is honestly the linchpin, the bottleneck, the key thing that's needed if you are going to do work in space. Now, I think there are four main arguments I generally use to justify this. I, of course, talk about the specific defense need and why that is important for a space launch, and why a space launch capability is important for that. I talk specifically about the direct economic benefits of space launch in Canada. Of course, I talk about the way a self-sufficient space launch capability can protect Canada from potentially adverse foreign actors. And of course, the critical part is the impact of space launch as an enabler for the rest of the Canadian space ecosystem. Today, in terms of defense, there are quite a few countries, some of which are honestly similar in size and GDP and population to Canada, that are now developing space launch capabilities. France, of course, while it already has its own space launch capability with the Ariane rocket, has stated that they want to have a quick launch capability now, and they're focusing on smaller companies like Latitude and Maya. The United Kingdom, of course, has stressed the importance of using dual-use technologies with their new crop of commercial launchers like Orbex and Skyrora. And very recently, Sweden, just this February, came out and said that they want a national responsive launch capability to support their defense needs. Why are all these countries all of a sudden starting to say, this is a capability we really need to see? There's a few good reasons. Of course, there's timely and reliable access to space for space assets. There's the ability to quickly launch assets into space to replace damaged or destroyed satellites. There is, of course, the reverse capability if we want to do harm to other assets in space. It also enables the related capabilities within a country to build missiles like hypersonic missiles, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. And of course, it builds a defense industrial base and cultivates a large base of talented individuals, of highly qualified personnel who can build these technologies. And even today, we're seeing that Canada's own strategy includes several items that would be enabled and enhanced by a sovereign launch capability. For instance, enhancing our defense industrial base was listed, as well as enhancing North American missile defense and acquiring a long-range missile capability and a worldwide satellite communications capability. In terms of the economic benefits of supporting this, we see a few. I think the one that I think is most tangible right now in Canada is, of course, the revenue that's being lost going abroad to pay for launches from other countries. Over the past 6 years, I think we've sent about $100 million out of Canada just to launch our payloads, and I think this is honestly probably an undercount. Just this year, we're going to be launching 36 more payloads. That may be upwards of $10 million, if not more, that we're sending out of Canada. And the Telesat contract with SpaceX to launch their Lightspeed constellation could be worth upwards of $1.4 billion. And keep in mind, Canada is funding Telesat with a $2.4 billion loan. So a lot of this is tax dollars that is flowing out of Canada to build Canadian capabilities. If we want to look at a quick case study, New Zealand is one of the most recent countries to develop its own launch capability. Back in 2016, there was a group called the Superior Research Group, which predicted that a space launch capability in New Zealand could yield potentially around $94 to $244 million in direct benefits to the country per year. I think what we see today is far more significant. By 2019, the New Zealand space economy had over 1.75 billion New Zealand dollars in revenues. By 2021, Rocket Lab had built a supply chain in New Zealand of more than 300 companies. In 2023, they had almost 250 million US dollars in revenues. And of course, they've launched 146 payloads, around 90% of which have been US payloads, highlighting the fact that a sovereign launch capability enables international business to come into New Zealand, and that's what it could do for Canada as well. The third point I wanted to talk about is, I think, a bit more controversial. What I'm showing here is some of the launch vehicles that are available today to Canadian payloads. And the most prolific, it doesn't show up too well, is of course SpaceX at the top. They have launched 134 rockets in 2024, far exceeding any other global power, any other company in the world. If you are a Canadian payload manufacturer, you're probably launching with SpaceX. Not only do they have the most launch volume, they're also the cheapest. But I think by comparing SpaceX with Rocket Lab, we can see that there might be some downsides to this. Rocket Lab, of course, has its margins on its launch business squeezed to absolutely nothing. And you can see that on the pricing, SpaceX is still 1/4 of the price that Rocket Lab provides. There's a potential data to suggest that SpaceX may be using its monopoly position to squeeze the margins of competitors, potentially pushing them out. And I don't think a monopoly is something that would benefit Canadian space at all, as SpaceX, using monopoly power, could pressure the upstream and downstream portions of the value chain, potentially putting Canadian businesses out of business. All this to say, self-sufficiency would, of course, protect the Canadian space economy and enable greater economic benefits for Canada. The last point I wanted to hit on is sort of based on a report that was published by Deloitte and Space Canada in 2024. It called for a goal of a $40 billion Canadian space economy by 2040. I don't think, given the Canadian space economy's current trajectory, that this is achievable today. As you can see, space revenue in Canada has been largely stagnant and has even declined in the past few years. Comparing this to global numbers, you can see that the American space economy has been able to grow slightly as compared to our economy. But if you look at what the numbers actually represent here, the 40 by 40 goal presented by Deloitte would require a 12% year-over-year increase in revenues in Canada in the space sector. The most aggressive estimate, which I think came from the World Economic Forums, said that the global space economy would only grow at about 9% year-over-year. So I think what we can see here is that we're currently lacking a lot of momentum to hit these kinds of goals for the Canadian space sector. And I think the launch file shows why this is the case. Globally, Canada is the only G7 nation not to have its own sovereign space launch capability or to have a government commitment towards developing this capability. And this is even though, as a space economy, we do have quite significant revenues. I would point out that from a government perspective, having a space economy could enable two key items that would make the Canadian space economy grow much faster. First of all, it could enable an end-to-end industry offering, allowing for the complete execution of a space mission within Canada. This would significantly simplify the supply chains, it would reduce risk, and it would reduce cost. As one example, and I think it was Adam who already mentioned this, the RADARSAT-2 mission is something where we were not being able to launch a critical defense payload, specifically because it had to leave the country. This resulted in delays, increased costs, and of course we had to go launch on a Soyuz rocket. I don't think this is possible to do today. The second item, of course, is an increased ROI for public investment. A lot of the cost, like I mentioned before, is going abroad for these space missions. If the cost is staying in Canada, the government is more likely to see the economic benefits of investing in space missions, which in and of itself could make space a more investable sector for the Canadian government, resulting in more space missions and more economic activity. I have quite a few ideas for what the Canadian government can do to enable this, but I think at the end of the day, it all boils down to Canada needs to spend on this capability if it wants to have this capability. It's certainly possible that the private sector could come in and could spend some of its own money, but I think the bottom line is a big chunk of that money is going to have to come from the Canadian government. There isn't really any other way to make this happen. You, as non-government actors, can, of course, work with the Canadian government and lobby the Canadian government for this capability. Specifically, my suggestion for a national space strategy is that we adopt a whole value chain approach where we focus on every item in the value chain needed to deliver value from space. And right now, the key part of that value chain that is lacking is specifically the launch capability. I think that's about everything I wanted to say and about all I have the time for. If you want to read the whole report, I put it up here. And if there's questions, I think we have about 3 minutes, so that might be like 1 or 2 questions. No. The data is just not available.
In terms of motivating the Canadian government to be investing in space launch capabilities, how can we leverage making our solutions applicable to the needs of the public when we're also sitting in a time where we have housing crisis needs, which is what the general public is much more concerned about? That's not to disparage. I strongly believe in the value of this work, taking part in it myself, but how can we leverage it to get the public to do the pushing for us?
I think when it comes down to it, the critical part that the Canadian government would need to emphasize is that this is building Canadian industry, this is building high-value Canadian industry, and this is going to inevitably result in high-paying jobs for Canadians. Like, it's not solving the housing crisis. Like, I'm not going to say that a launch solution is ever going to do that, but this is something where we are growing our own economy and enabling Canadians in this room to have jobs and to build their own wealth.
Exactly what's the reason for SpaceX's such low prices for launch, and what does it take for us to compete with SpaceX?
I think there's 2 reasons. Number one, SpaceX is a very innovative and very capable company, and they have been able to work very hard and lower their own cost of launch through innovative technical solutions as well as just good general engineering. I think the other part of it is that they have a far superior access to capital than probably any other company in the space industry. They're able to leverage this access to capital to keep low margins while continuing to develop their products. How can we compete with that? Honestly, it's not going to be very easy. I would say it would take a lot of work from Canadian engineers to lower the cost of our own products, but I think there's also room to innovate, to look at different solutions that are looking at different segments of the market than simply the heavy launch, which is what SpaceX specializes in.
Thank you, Neil. Everybody, a nice warm round of applause for Neil Woodcock.
Thank you.